Iceland, a land of stunning landscapes, where glaciers and volcanoes shape the earth. But beneath this breathtaking scenery lies an even more fascinating story, one that isn't written in sagas or ancient manuscripts. It's written in the DNA of its people. Icelanders today are among the most genetically unique populations in the world, carrying a story that stretches back over 1,000 years. A story shaped by Viking conquests, Celtic migrations, deadly plagues, and centuries of isolation. Unlike most nations that saw waves of immigration and genetic mixing, Iceland's gene pool remained locked away, isolated in the North Atlantic, evolving separately from the rest of Europe. But why does this matter? Because hidden within Icelandic DNA are secrets, mutations that can predict diseases, resistance to conditions like Alzheimer's, and even traces of their Viking and Gaelic ancestors. Scientists today are using Iceland's genetic history to unlock groundbreaking discoveries about human evolution, disease, and longevity. But how did it all begin? More than 1,000 years ago, Iceland was an empty, untouched land. No humans had ever set foot there until the 9th century, when a fleet of Norse longships arrived on its shores. These weren't just explorers, they were settlers, seeking new lands beyond the crowded fjords of Norway. But they weren't alone. Along with them came a group of people who would shape Iceland's genetic makeup in ways few could have predicted: the Celts. Taken from Ireland and Scotland, either as wives, workers, or in some cases, slaves, these Gaelic men and women became an integral part of Iceland's early society. Genetic evidence tells a fascinating story. While the majority of Icelandic male settlers were Norse, about 75 to 80%, their female ancestors were overwhelmingly Gaelic, around 62 to 63%. This means Iceland's founding population was not purely Scandinavian, but a mix of Viking warriors and Celtic women. This unique combination gave Icelanders a genetic structure unlike any other in the world. Unlike mainland Scandinavia, where Viking bloodlines mixed over time with other European groups, Iceland's genetic pool remained confined, creating an unbroken link to these early settlers. This gender-skewed ancestry had long-term effects, not just on Iceland's genes, but on its culture and language as well. While the Norsemen brought their dialect, which would evolve into modern Icelandic, the genetic influence of the Gaelic settlers persisted in mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mother to child. This means that while Icelanders speak a language almost identical to Old Norse, their maternal genetic heritage tells a different story, one rooted in the green hills of Ireland and Scotland. By the year 930, Iceland's population was firmly established, with the descendants of Vikings and Celts forming a distinct society, cut off from the rest of the world. But what happened next would set Iceland's genetics on a course different from any other nation in Europe. Isolation, natural disasters, and the struggle for survival would turn Iceland into one of the most genetically unique populations on Earth. Over 1,000 years ago, a group of seafarers braved the icy waters of the North Atlantic, searching for a new land. What they found was an uninhabited volcanic island, a place of black sand beaches, towering glaciers, and endless wilderness. This was Iceland, a land where survival would be a test of endurance, strength, and resilience. But who were the people who built the first settlements in this harsh and unforgiving landscape? Historical records tell us that Iceland's earliest inhabitants were Norse Vikings and Gaelic settlers from Ireland and Scotland. But DNA tells a story that is far more complex. When geneticists analyzed the Y chromosomes passed from father to son, they found that the majority, about 75 to 80%, came from Scandinavia. The men who founded Iceland were, without a doubt, Viking warriors, explorers, and traders. But when they looked at mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from the mother, the results revealed something unexpected. More than 60% of Iceland's earliest women were of Gaelic origin. This tells us something crucial about Iceland's founding population. Many of the women who became the mothers of Iceland were not Norse at all, but rather Irish and Scottish, brought to the island through a complex web of alliances, migrations, and, in some cases, forced relocation. Viking raiders frequently targeted coastal villages in Ireland and Scotland, taking captives and bringing them to their settlements across the North Atlantic. Some of these women would eventually be taken to Iceland, where they became part of the new society taking shape. Unlike the vast, ever-expanding kingdoms of mainland Europe, Iceland was settled by a relatively small number of people, estimated at around 10,000 to 20,000 individuals. This meant that the genes of those early settlers became the foundation of the entire Icelandic population. With little new genetic material coming in over the centuries, Icelanders today are still carrying the DNA of those first Viking and Gaelic ancestors. What makes Iceland's genetic history even more remarkable is how little it has changed over time. Unlike neighboring countries, where conquests, trade, and immigration brought in new genetic influences, Iceland remained isolated. The people who arrived during the Viking Age formed a closed genetic loop, one that would shape the Icelandic population for centuries to come. As time passed, this genetic isolation would lead to something rarely seen in human populations: an extraordinary level of homogeneity. Today, Icelanders are more genetically similar to each other than almost any other population in the world. But this isn't just an interesting historical fact. It has had profound consequences, affecting everything from disease inheritance to scientific discoveries that could change the future of medicine. For over 1,000 years, the people of Iceland have lived on the edge of the Arctic, cut off from the rest of the world by vast oceans and an unforgiving climate. Unlike other European populations that mixed and evolved with new migrations, Iceland remained genetically sealed, a living time capsule of its Viking and Celtic ancestors. But this isolation didn't just preserve the past. It reshaped the very DNA of its people, making them one of the most genetically unique populations in the world. Every human population carries a mix of genetic traits passed down from generation to generation. But when a group remains isolated for centuries, something extraordinary happens: genetic drift. This is a process where random changes in gene frequencies occur over time, not because of natural selection, but simply by chance. In Iceland, this meant that some genetic variations became far more common, while others disappeared entirely. One of the most striking results of this isolation is Iceland's unusually high genetic homogeneity. While the country's earliest settlers were a mix of Norse and Gaelic ancestry, today's Icelanders share a gene pool that is significantly less diverse than their original founders. Studies show that genetic variation in Icelanders is lower than in most European populations, meaning they are more closely related to each other than people from larger, more mixed nations. This phenomenon has also led to something scientists call the founder effect, a situation where a small number of individuals give rise to an entire population. Since Iceland's population was established by a relatively small group of settlers, their descendants inherited a limited set of genetic traits. Over time, the genetic makeup of Iceland shifted away from that of its original source populations. Modern Icelanders are still genetically closest to Norwegians, Scots, and Irish people, but they have developed a unique genetic signature that sets them apart from all three. However, this homogeneity does not mean that all Icelanders are identical. While the overall genetic pool is more uniform than in other countries, subtle regional differences still exist. Genetic studies have found that individuals from different parts of Iceland, north, south, east, and west, carry slight variations in their DNA. These differences aren't due to separate ancestral origins, but rather to generations of families living in isolated areas, where specific genetic traits became more common in certain regions. This unique genetic structure has made Iceland an invaluable resource for scientists studying human heredity and disease. Because Icelanders share such a well-preserved gene pool, researchers can identify how specific genetic traits have been passed down through generations with incredible precision. Iceland's genetic history isn't just a relic of the past. It's a key to unlocking the mysteries of human genetics itself. For centuries, Iceland's population endured some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Freezing winters, volcanic eruptions, and deadly plagues tested the resilience of its people time and time again. But beyond the struggle for survival, these disasters left another, less visible impact, one written in the very DNA of Icelanders. Each catastrophe reshaped the genetic makeup of the population, reducing diversity and amplifying certain genetic traits in ways that would define Icelanders for generations. Throughout history, Iceland's population never grew large. By the 18th century, it still numbered only around 50,000 people. But this wasn't just because of isolation. It was because time and time again, disasters wiped out entire portions of the population, forcing the survivors to rebuild from near extinction. The first major genetic bottleneck came in the early 1400s when the Black Death swept across Iceland, claiming over half of its people in just a few short years. With no immunity to the disease, entire family lines vanished overnight. The survivors passed down a much smaller gene pool, permanently altering the course of Icelandic genetics. But the devastation didn't stop there. A second plague struck in the late 15th century, once again reducing the population by nearly a third. And in 1707, a deadly smallpox outbreak claimed up to 25% of Icelanders, creating yet another drastic reduction in genetic diversity. Each of these events was like a reset button, eliminating rare genetic variations and amplifying the traits of those who survived. One of the most devastating events in Icelandic history came not from disease, but from the very earth itself. In 1783, the Loki volcanic eruption unleashed a disaster unlike anything Icelanders had faced before. Over 8 months, the volcano spewed toxic gases into the air, poisoning crops, contaminating water, and killing most of the livestock. With food supplies wiped out, famine set in, and nearly a quarter of Iceland's population starved to death. This was more than just a natural disaster. It was another massive genetic bottleneck. These repeated population crashes had profound effects on Icelandic DNA. When a population shrinks drastically and then regrows from a smaller group of survivors, genetic drift becomes even stronger. Some genetic variants that were once rare became common simply by chance, while others disappeared entirely. Over time, this process made Icelanders genetically distinct, separating them even further from their original Norse and Gaelic ancestors. Today, genetic studies can still detect the echoes of these disasters in Icelandic DNA. Researchers have found evidence of genetic markers that were likely shaped by these population bottlenecks, some of which may even contribute to the increased prevalence of certain diseases in Icelanders today. But despite these hardships, Iceland's population always found a way to recover. Each time catastrophe struck, the survivors carried their ancestors' genes forward, ensuring that Iceland's story, written in its DNA, would never be lost. Deep within the Icelandic gene pool lies something extraordinary, mutations that exist almost nowhere else in the world. Over centuries of isolation, certain genetic traits became more common, while others faded away, creating a unique biological landscape. Some of these mutations have devastating effects, increasing the risk of life-threatening diseases, but others hold secrets that could change the future of medicine, offering insights into conditions that affect millions of people worldwide. One of the most well-known genetic anomalies in Iceland is the BRCA2999del5 mutation, a tiny alteration in the DNA that has massive consequences. This single mutation is responsible for nearly 40% of male breast cancer cases in Iceland, a rate far higher than anywhere else. In women, it significantly increases the likelihood of developing breast and ovarian cancer. Scientists believe this mutation can be traced back to a single Icelandic ancestor centuries ago. Because the population remained relatively small and closed, the mutation persisted and spread. Today, genetic screening in Iceland specifically looks for this variant, allowing early detection and treatment of those at risk. But not all Icelandic mutations are harmful. In 2012, researchers made a groundbreaking discovery, an ABT gene variant found almost exclusively in Icelanders that appears to protect against Alzheimer's disease. Unlike the mutations that increase disease risk, this rare genetic change seems to slow down the buildup of amyloid plaques in the brain, a key factor in Alzheimer's development. Carriers of this mutation not only have a lower risk of dementia, but also tend to experience slower cognitive decline as they age. This discovery has sparked global interest, with pharmaceutical researchers exploring ways to replicate its effects in Alzheimer's treatments. Then there's HCCAA, or Icelandic brain disease, a condition so rare that it's found almost nowhere else in the world. This disorder, caused by a mutation in the CST3 gene, leads to repeated strokes at an early age, often proving fatal before the age of 30. Geneticists have traced this mutation back to a single family lineage in northwest Iceland, meaning every person who has ever developed this disease is distantly related. This is a prime example of how Iceland's genetic bottlenecks allowed rare mutations to become far more common in a specific population than they would have in a larger, more diverse society. Iceland's genetic makeup has also provided valuable insights into heart disease, diabetes, and even schizophrenia. Scientists have identified unique genetic variants in Icelanders that influence cholesterol levels, blood sugar regulation, and mental health disorders. Many of these findings have contributed to global research, helping scientists understand how genes influence disease across all human populations. While some of these genetic traits have been shaped by chance, others may have been influenced by natural selection. In a harsh, unpredictable environment like Iceland, survival often depended on adaptability. Certain genetic variations may have provided advantages in terms of immunity, metabolism, or resistance to environmental stressors, allowing those traits to persist over generations. Today, Iceland remains at the forefront of genetic research, using its unique gene pool to uncover medical breakthroughs that could benefit people far beyond its borders. What started as a small Viking settlement has become one of the most important populations for understanding human genetics. Proof that even in the most isolated corners of the world, DNA holds the power to change the future. In the world of genetics, few places are as scientifically valuable as Iceland. A small, isolated population with well-documented ancestry makes it an ideal place to study how genes influence health, disease, and even human evolution. But what makes Iceland's genetic research so groundbreaking isn't just the uniqueness of its DNA. It's the way scientists have used it to uncover some of the most important medical discoveries of our time. At the heart of this revolution is Iceland Genetics, a research company that has spent decades analyzing the DNA of Icelanders to unlock secrets buried deep within the human genome. Using extensive genealogical records and high-tech sequencing, Decode has mapped out how specific genetic mutations pass through generations, allowing them to pinpoint the origins of both rare and common diseases. This research has made Iceland one of the most important genetic laboratories on the planet. One of the most significant breakthroughs came in 2015, when researchers completed the largest ever whole genome sequencing project of an entire nation. By sequencing the DNA of over 2,600 Icelanders and cross-referencing it with genetic data from over 100,000 more, scientists built one of the most detailed maps of human genetic variation ever created. This research identified more than 20 million genetic variants, including rare mutations that were previously unknown to science. One of the most valuable aspects of this research is how it helps scientists understand disease inheritance. For example, Icelandic researchers were among the first to identify key genetic risk factors for schizophrenia, shedding light on the biological origins of this complex mental illness. They also helped uncover mutations linked to heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and even liver disorders, leading to new insights into how these conditions develop. But perhaps one of the most intriguing discoveries was the identification of human knockouts, individuals who have naturally occurring genetic mutations that completely disable certain genes without causing harm. By studying these individuals, scientists can determine what specific genes do and how they contribute to health and disease. This has led to major breakthroughs in drug development, as pharmaceutical companies use this knowledge to design treatments that mimic these natural genetic changes. Another revolutionary aspect of Iceland's genetic research is how it combines ancient DNA analysis with modern genetics. In recent years, scientists have sequenced the genomes of Viking-era Icelandic skeletons, comparing them to the DNA of modern Icelanders. These studies confirmed that early Icelanders were a mix of Norse and Gaelic ancestry, but they also revealed something unexpected. Over time, Iceland's genetic makeup drifted away from both. The modern Icelandic population is genetically distinct from its original settlers, proving how centuries of isolation and genetic bottlenecks altered their DNA. Beyond just understanding the past, Iceland's genetic research is shaping the future. The country's national biobank, which stores genetic and health data from thousands of citizens, is being used to predict disease risk, allowing for personalized medicine, a future where treatments are tailored to an individual's unique genetic profile. This research is also helping scientists develop new drugs that target genetic pathways involved in diseases, potentially leading to longer, healthier lives for people worldwide. Iceland has become a global model for genetic research, demonstrating the power of using an isolated population to make discoveries that benefit all of humanity. What began as a scientific curiosity, how a small island's DNA changed over time, has turned into a groundbreaking tool for medicine, proving that the answers to some of the world's biggest health challenges might just be hidden in the genes of Icelanders. Across the icy landscapes of Iceland, a story is woven deep within the DNA of its people, a story of survival, adaptation, and genetic transformation that has made Icelanders distinct from the rest of Europe. But while they share ancestry with the Norse and Gaelic peoples, modern genetic studies reveal a fascinating truth. Icelanders are no longer identical to their founders. Over 1,000 years of isolation have created subtle but measurable differences, setting them apart even from their closest relatives. In genetic distance charts, Icelanders cluster nearest to Norwegians, Scots, and Irish, a direct reflection of their Viking and Celtic origins. Yet, despite these close ties, Icelanders are genetically distinct from both groups today. This is the result of a combination of genetic drift, repeated population bottlenecks, and centuries of living in near-complete isolation from the rest of Europe. One of the most striking differences is in genetic diversity. Unlike mainland Scandinavia, which continued to mix with new populations over time, Iceland remained largely closed off. As a result, modern Icelanders have fewer rare genetic variants than their Norwegian ancestors, meaning they share more similarities with each other than the average population in Europe. In fact, Icelanders today have a higher probability of sharing common ancestors within just a few generations. Another key difference is how Icelandic DNA has shifted away from its original proportions. Ancient DNA studies reveal that the first settlers of Iceland were around 57% Norse and 43% Gaelic, but modern Icelanders are about 70% Norse and 30% Gaelic. This means that, over time, Norse ancestry became more dominant in the population. While the exact reasons are still debated, some theories suggest that Norse lineages had higher reproductive success, or that later waves of settlers reinforced Scandinavian genetic influence. But genetic uniqueness doesn't just come from ancestry. It also comes from how genes evolve over time. Icelanders have experienced natural selection in ways that other European populations haven't. Some researchers believe that Iceland's harsh environment may have contributed to small genetic adaptations, such as metabolism-related genes, that helped early settlers survive extreme winters with limited food. Even within Iceland, minor genetic differences exist between regions. Scientists studying thousands of Icelandic genomes have found subtle variations in DNA between the north, south, east, and west of the country. These aren't due to separate ancestral groups, but rather to centuries of local isolation, where certain genetic traits became slightly more common in different parts of the island. However, despite these regional nuances, Icelanders remain one of the most genetically homogeneous populations in the world. So, how different are Icelanders from other Europeans? The answer lies somewhere between familiarity and uniqueness. They still share strong genetic ties to Scandinavia and the British Isles, but their centuries of isolation have set them apart. Their DNA holds clues to how populations change over time, how genetic drift shapes evolution, and how an entire nation can become a living time capsule of its past. Iceland's remarkable genetic research has uncovered groundbreaking discoveries, but it has also sparked some of the most intense ethical debates in modern science. When an entire nation's DNA becomes a resource for medical research, who truly owns that data? Can genetics be used for the greater good without sacrificing individual privacy? And how does a small, close-knit society navigate the fine line between scientific progress and personal rights? These questions became central to Iceland's genetic revolution in the late 1990s, when a private company, Decode Genetics, proposed an ambitious project, creating a national health database that would link genetic information with medical records from nearly every citizen. The goal was revolutionary. By mapping out genetic risk factors across the entire population, scientists could predict and potentially prevent diseases before they even developed. But there was one problem. This database wasn't going to be voluntary. Under the original plan, Icelanders' medical records would be included automatically unless they chose to opt out. For many, this raised serious concerns. Could someone's DNA be studied without their explicit consent? Was it ethical for a private company to have exclusive rights to an entire nation's genetic code? And even if the data was anonymized, could Iceland's small population make true anonymity impossible? The controversy erupted into national debate, dividing scientists, lawmakers, and the public. Many saw the potential benefits, a chance to advance medical research at an unprecedented scale, leading to treatments for diseases that affect people worldwide. But others feared that such a massive genetic database could be misused, whether by insurance companies, pharmaceutical firms, or even governments. Legal challenges followed, and in 2003, Iceland's Supreme Court ruled against parts of the project, emphasizing that personal genetic data could not be automatically included without proper consent. This decision forced a major shift in how genetic research was conducted in Iceland. Instead of an opt-out system, participation became strictly voluntary, ensuring that only those who actively agreed to provide their DNA would be included in studies. This shift didn't stop genetic research in Iceland, it reshaped it. Today, over 90% of Icelanders who are approached agree to participate in studies, demonstrating a high level of public trust. Unlike the early controversy, modern research in Iceland is carefully regulated, with strict privacy protections in place. Biobanks and genetic databases now operate under ethical guidelines that prioritize consent, transparency, and responsible data use. But ethical concerns still linger. One of the biggest issues is genetic privacy. Even if individual names are removed, DNA is a unique identifier. If someone's genetic data is used in research, it indirectly reveals information about their relatives as well. This means that even those who choose not to participate in genetic studies could still be affected by findings linked to their family members. Another challenge is commercial ownership. While genetic research has led to medical breakthroughs, some fear that corporations could profit from discoveries made using public genetic data without giving back to the people who contributed it. Should Icelanders have a stake in the financial benefits that come from their DNA? Or does scientific progress outweigh personal claims to genetic information? Despite these debates, Iceland remains a world leader in genetic research. The country's ability to balance scientific advancement with ethical responsibility has made it a model for how modern genetics should be handled. Iceland's experience has influenced international policies, shaping global discussions on how genetic data should be collected, stored, and used in research. The future of genetic ethics is still unfolding, and Iceland's journey is far from over. But one thing is clear, genetics isn't just about science. It's about identity, privacy, and the fundamental question of who controls the code that makes us who we are. For centuries, Iceland's history has been told through sagas, epic tales of Viking voyages, feuds, and legendary heroes. But beneath these stories lies another kind of history, one written in the DNA of its people. From its earliest settlers to the cutting-edge genetic research of today, Iceland's genetic story is not just a relic of the past, it's a blueprint for the future. Iceland's isolation has made its people a living genetic archive, preserving the DNA of their Norse and Gaelic ancestors in ways that are rarely seen in human populations. But what makes this even more extraordinary is how scientists are using this genetic history to push the boundaries of medical research, evolutionary studies, and even the search for longevity. Genetic studies in Iceland are uncovering clues about how diseases develop and spread, offering potential breakthroughs for conditions like cancer, Alzheimer's, and heart disease. Researchers have found mutations in Icelanders that increase disease risk, but they have also discovered rare genetic traits that appear to protect against illness. These findings are already influencing the development of new drugs and treatments, some of which could change medicine forever. Beyond disease research, Iceland's genetics provide a unique window into human evolution. By studying how the Icelandic genome has shifted over the past 1,000 years, scientists are gaining insights into how populations adapt to extreme environments, how certain genes become dominant or disappear, and how isolated groups evolve differently from those in more genetically diverse regions. One of the most fascinating aspects of Icelandic genetics is its potential role in studying human lifespan. Certain genetic markers found in Icelanders have been linked to longer life expectancy and slower cognitive decline, raising the question, could Iceland's DNA hold the key to extending human life? Some researchers believe that Icelandic genetics could play a crucial role in future longevity studies, helping to unlock the secrets of aging and disease resistance. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Iceland's genetic history is what it tells us about the future of genetics itself. As technology advances, we are moving closer to a world where genetic data could be used to predict, prevent, and even modify human traits. The research being done in Iceland is shaping global discussions about the ethics of genetic engineering, personalized medicine, and the role of DNA in shaping our health and identity. Iceland's genetic story is far from over. In many ways, it is only just beginning. The discoveries being made today could transform the way we understand genetics, not just for Icelanders, but for people all over the world. From Viking settlers to modern-day scientists, Iceland's DNA continues to shape the past, present, and future of humanity.